This is said to have happened a long time ago, maybe back in the 20s or 30s. This story is about a Navajo man who was working as a ranch hand for a rich Navajo who had a lot of horses and cattle and sheep all around the western part of the Navajo Rez in Tuba City, Arizona. One day, he decided to go home to see what his relatives were doing somewhere past Shiprock, New Mexico. So he talked to his supervisor and asked to take leave, and he was going to go home to see his family. So he packed a good horse and started off his long journey home early in the morning, cross country through canyons, mesas, and open country. Somewhere along the way, he stopped for a rest stop, and while he was resting, he spotted an old mangy coyote sitting on top of a hill not too far away. He took out his rifle, aimed, and fired. The coyote slumped over and didn't move again, so he climbs up to see his kill, and there, laying before him, he couldn't believe his eyes. The dead body was that of a young Navajo man with long hair. His body was half human and bottom half animal. The upper part of the body was painted with designs, and his lower half was coyote. He had shot a Yenagloshi. It must have been resting like he was when he shot it. He got scared and didn't know what to do with it. He walked around and he saw a deep crevice along the edge, so he dragged its body and threw it down, only hearing its body hit somewhere deep down in the dark crevice. As scared as he was, he decided he needed to distance himself away from it, across Chinle Valley and over the Big Chuska Mountains. He rode all day and into the night, pushing his horse to the limit. He was finally able to make it across the Chuska Mountains and past Shiprock to a relative's home, where he told him what happened. They told him to never go back to his employer and to stay there because the relatives of the Skinwalker would sure be looking for answers and be out looking for him. Several months passed, and one day he felt safe enough to come out of hiding, and there was a ceremony happening somewhere around Shiprock. He decided to attend. When he got to the ceremony, there were many people in attendance, camping, and with their wagons parked here and there. And just as he was beginning to enjoy the ceremony, there was an old Navajo man walking around among the people, talking out loud. The old man was saying they were looking for a son who had gone missing a couple of months ago. The old man was telling everybody about his son's journey and where his son had last stopped and where he was last seen. He said he had gone missing after his last known location and never showed up at the next stop. The old man was describing exactly the young Navajo and the area of the rest where he had shot it. Next, the old man says, "And there is one man that knows what happened to our son, and he is here among you today. We are camped over there, and we would like for you to come over to our camp and tell us what you know about what happened to our son." The guy knew the old Navajo man was talking about him, and somehow knew he was in attendance at the ceremony. He said he left the ceremony as quickly and quietly as possible, and he stayed hiding for many years at his home. He said he never went back to work for his employer over on the western part of the Navajo Rez, and he stayed home. After many years later, he finally came out of hiding, and he told his story to only a few people that he trusted. He said he never went back to the western part of the Navajo Rez. You may ask, how did the people find out this was the man? Well, when the old man announced his search for his missing son at the ceremony, it wasn't a coincidence. You see, Navajo ceremonies serve as channels through which communication with the spirit world is done. I won't go too much into detail, but there are ceremonies where prayers are offered, tobacco, invoking the assistance of spirits for guidance and clarity. Through this process, secrets, revelations can surface, shedding light on mysteries and revealing the truth that's hidden beneath the surface. There's also the communication with elders, as their experience and connection to the Navajo traditions and medicine provide valuable guidance. You see, they have the knowledge passed down through generations, enabling them to decipher the signs and messages from the spiritual side of things with wisdom and discernment. Let the story be a reminder of digging into things that are beyond our understanding and the weight of the choices we make. Within the Navajo tradition, encountering a skinwalker can possibly bring a curse onto your life. So let this be a reminder to be careful, respect the cultural beliefs, and be mindful of the unseen that exists in the world around us. I was always a solitary kid growing up. I grew up on the outskirts of my little town that I grew up in and never really had any friends. I would hang out with someone here and there, but for the most part, I stuck to myself. Even in high school, I found time to invest in hobbies such as fishing, hunting, and playing cards. I used to always love a game of spades with my parents and little brother. Even though I loved all the hobbies that I did, hunting was my favorite. I would go hunting on all sorts of critters when it was in season, and I would spend hours just to hunt something. You see, the fun part of it wasn't the fact that I just killed something. It was the fact that I had outsmarted the animal. I now had a trophy to signify my victory. Nothing would come close to the feeling that I would get when I came home with a fresh kill under my belt. I would spend days out in the wilderness to hunt, and I would get lost out there with nature, with nothing but the sounds of the other creatures that filled the woods in which I was choosing to steal life away from. Due to my love for hunting and fishing, I never found time to do schoolwork. I passed all my classes with at least a C, and I graduated high school. But further education was not something destined for me. I was convinced hunting was my calling. After high school, I began to go hunting, not just for pleasure, but for work as well. There was a company close by to my hometown that made deer jerky and was looking for hunters that could get the meat. Of course, me, the self-proclaimed lover of such activities, applied for this position, and after a week of waiting, I got the job. I was to begin as of right then and there, so I grabbed my gear and went out to the woods and set up shop in the tree stand, the same tree stand that I had been using for as long as I can remember, and I began to wait. I must have sat in that stand for hours, because soon the sun was beginning to set. It was summer though, so I knew I had some time before I was shrouded in darkness. And that's when I saw him. There was a male buck. It got into view all the way on the horizon. I sat there watching it, mesmerized by how it was moving. It calmly paced the forest floor, bending over here and there to eat some grass or berries, until finally it came to the creek that I had set my stand up near to. It stood for a moment. It looked around and dropped its head to take a much needed sip of water. This was it, the moment that I had been waiting for. I raised my rifle, knowing I had only one shot, and I aimed at it directly behind his front shoulder. I took a deep breath. My shot was perfect. It traveled directly through the buck's heart, and it killed him on the spot. My heart swelled as again I knew I won. All this waiting was not in vain. I nearly flew down the steps to my stand and rushed over to the buck. His eyes were still open. I was glad it was instant though, so that he wouldn't have to suffer. I picked him up and soon I was back home. I called the company and soon they had someone come over to my house and pick up the latest kill. I thanked the man as he left and shut my door, feeling more proud than ever. I knew that this is what I was going to do for the rest of my life, or so I thought. A few years passed and I continued doing what I loved, and eventually I received enough money from hunting that I moved away from my hometown and moved to West Virginia, as I heard that the hunting there was great. I wanted to live out in the backcountry, as I wanted to go hunting all the time. and I found a place where I could do just that. There was an old cabin, not too expensive, and it sat right there in the forest, not too far away from a town, maybe a 15 or 20-minute drive, so not completely isolated. I liked it, and I made a couple of friends in town as well. Most of them like hunting, but only one ever wanted to come with me to go. His name is Brian. Brian's a good guy, so we got along well, and we gone hunting a few times. The only difference between us is that he's got a full family, wife, the kids, even has a golden retriever. He's a lucky guy, I'll tell you that. He's a good shot too, and I'm glad he's my hunting partner. I had set up my tree stand maybe a week after buying the cabin out in the forest, and maybe a month after that is when Brian and I first went hunting together. We sat up in that stand for hours, waiting for something to turn up. Eventually, a doe did show up, and we did our thing and carried her back to my cabin. At this point, I had already learned enough about the making of jerky to know how to do it myself, and with the help of Brian, we skinned the doe, and we began making jerky and steaks. We would go hunting maybe once or twice every 2 weeks, but I would go hunting almost every night. At this point, I had found another company somewhat close by, maybe an hour away, that again needed hunters to gather meat. So once again I applied and got the job. Everything seemed to be going well. I was good at my job and it also paid well. Almost every night, I was always up in the tree stand for so long, so I knew just about every sound in the woods, from the elk to mountain lion screams, all the way to foxes and coyotes. You give me a noise out in the woods and I could tell you exactly what animal it is, and sometimes even tell you the gender of it. That's what made this night so different. Like always, I was up in my stand, and that's when I heard it, a scream. I played it off like it was nothing, because it was most likely nothing. Except this time, the scream was different. It sounded similar to something I heard before, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Brian was with me and he also couldn't figure it out. Most of the time we don't really care about these noises, as it's not exactly our business to worry about every little sound we hear in the woods at night. However, this noise was just wrong. Something was not right with this scream. Something was not right about it. And after a good 10 minutes of sitting through it and thinking through every animal it could be, Brian and I decided that we would go check it out. After all, we were both armed and had good shots, and if it was a mountain lion, we figured it would run away as soon as it heard us coming. We got down from the stand and began our walk towards the direction of the scream. After a minute or two, we could tell we were getting closer because the noise was just getting louder. It seemed to echo throughout the trees, and I'm not gonna lie when I say it freaked us both out a little bit. However, we continued on, and after another minute of hiking, we stumbled upon a clearing, where we saw where the noise was coming from. It was a huge elk, standing in the middle of the clearing, just screaming out into the night. We looked at each other, and through the look on Brian's face, I could tell he still shared the same uneasiness that I was feeling. We turned to look at the huge elk, still screaming, and deciding to let it be. We walked all the way back to the stand. After some back and forth, we decided it would be in our best interest to call it a night and just go home. When we hunted at night, Brian usually stayed in the guest room in my cabin, as it was always late when we got done, around 2 or 3 in the morning, and he didn't want to wake up his children or his wife when he got home, so he would crash at my place. However, even though we were far away now from the elk, it seemed like it was following us, because the screams were just as loud as ever. This did kind of freak us both out, but we figured if we went to sleep, it would all be over in the morning. So we did. However, it wasn't the ending. When we woke up, the scream had disappeared. Brian said goodbye, and he left for his home. I did the same routine. I went into town and waited until dusk before going back out into the woods and into my stand. I was still a bit unnerved from last night, but I figured this would help me get my mind off of it, and it did. That was until midnight, when I heard the scream again. This time, however, the scream really sounded wrong. Like, really wrong. I could tell this was not the same scream from last night, but again, I couldn't tell what type of animal it was. I hoped and prayed that it would go away, but it didn't. The screaming continued on and on until I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what the hell was screaming in the dead of night. I set out in the same direction as last night, expecting for the worst to be awaiting me. I continued through the underbrush until finally I reached the clearing from the night prior. What I saw this time shook me to my core. There was no elk, like I had expected. Instead, there was a figure standing in the middle of the clearing, facing away from me. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was witnessing. This thing was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and I couldn't tell if it was human or something else. I'll admit it, I was fucking terrified. I had never seen something like this before, and I was ready to book it away from there. I didn't want whatever this thing was to see me though, so I backpedaled as slow as I could, staring at this thing for as long as it was in view. As soon as it was just on the horizon, it stopped screaming. I froze and thought, why did it stop? I wondered. I stood there in the trees, dumbfounded, staring at this fucking 8-foot tall creature that had just been screaming in the middle of the woods. I realized now what a fatal mistake I had made by not running home as soon as I saw this thing. As I was standing there, it turned around, and my body was struck with fear. Even though I was at least 300 yards away from this thing, I know it was staring directly at me, and it knew that I was there. Its yellow eyes were piercing into my heart. As it got down on all fours and began screaming once again, it started galloping towards me. I stood there frozen for another moment before booking it. I knew all the shortcuts to my house, and I took every single one of them. Knowing that I didn't have much time left, I started sprinting faster than I ever had, hearing its echoing cries in the distance. Its growing intensity only proving I was going too slow. As the sound grew louder than ever, I saw my house. I fumbled with my keys to get to the one that opened my front door, and as I reached the porch, I found it. I unlocked the door and shut it as soon as I got there. The cries, the screaming, whatever the fuck it was screaming right outside. And I knew whatever this thing was, it was at my front door, walking around, searching for what I assume a way to get inside. Terrified, I hid in my freezer, where I hoped the smell of meat and ice would help mask my scent to this thing. After a few minutes, I heard the sound of glass breaking. Then, the sound of footsteps. This thing had found its way inside my house, and I could hear it moving around upstairs, tracking any signs of me, I know. I did try texting Brian to get over to my place, but my messages didn't go through. And given that it's 3 in the morning, I doubt he was gonna see them anyways. After about 30 minutes of not hearing this thing anymore, I got out, freezing, but I feel like my body was ignoring all that because I was too focused on trying to figure out if this thing had left. I sat there in the basement all night, aiming directly at the door, waiting to see if this thing showed up. It never did. I eventually fell asleep on the floor. The morning came. I woke up, and I noticed that the door to the basement was open. My heart fucking dropped. But I'm still here. So what happened? I'm not sure. But I will tell you what happened the days after. I ended up moving and selling that fucking house. As much as I love the outdoors, ever since that experience, I fucking moved out and never went back to living in the woods again. Everything happened so fast. I told Brian. I know he probably didn't believe me, but I didn't care. I moved out. I moved to a whole other fucking city, and I will never go into some woods again. A few days ago, I packed up my car and made my way to an Airbnb that I actually rented a few miles outside of Andrews, North Carolina. I live and work just north of ATL, and just felt like being in the city was draining what little bit of sanity that I had left. Most of my team, including myself, had switched to working remotely from home due to COVID, and since I live alone, I was starting to feel the mental toll of staring at the same four walls of my cramped one-bedroom apartment, day in and day out. A lot of people were struggling with the transitions to working from home, so the overall production went down, and the workload seemed to be piling up, more than we could keep up with. Project after project, they kept getting dumped into my lap, and since we're all cooped up inside all the time at home, I didn't feel like I could escape the crushing weight of all this added stress. One day, I felt that I had reached my breaking point. I submitted a time off notice to my supervisor. I booked an Airbnb and decided I would spend a couple of weeks near the national forest. I figured if I was going to be isolated, I could at least use a change of scenery. I had always enjoyed hiking and camping as a kid. In fact, moving to the big city for my job had always felt a little bit out of character for me. I was excited to reconnect with nature and enjoy everything that the park had to offer. I figured that because of all the lockdown restrictions, foot traffic on the hiking trails would be minimal, so I would basically have most of the woods to myself. The weather was supposed to be nice and cool for most of my visit, without being unbearably cold. Perfect for wandering around in the forest, fishing, bird watching, or whatever else I felt like doing. I left around sunrise and arrived at my rental shortly before noon. The cabin was well sized, and it was rustic but appeared to be well maintained. I retrieved the key from the lockbox near the front door, and I made my way inside to get settled. The cabin was quite a bit larger than my one-bedroom apartment in the city, but somehow it felt much more welcoming. I walked into the bedroom and took in the breathtaking view from out of the panoramic window that covered the back wall. Miles of forest for as far as the eye could see, gently fading into shades of green and gray, underneath the trees that only allowed scattered beams of sunlight to peek through. I thought about laying down on the bed with one of the books that I had brought along with me, but I decided against it, given that the day was still young and I was excited to go exploring. I had gotten rather lucky in finding this cabin rental. Not only was it secluded within the national forest, but one of the features that was on the website was that there was a private hiking trail that started right off to the side of the cabin itself. Several of the reviews that I read before booking said that the trail was scenic and captivating. A few miles in, the private trail would eventually dump out into one of the public hiking routes, but according to the reviews, no one had ever had a stranger come into the private trail and end up near the cabin. I laced up my hiking boots and headed out into the trail. Beautiful trees reaching high into the sky were towering over me, gently tossing in the wind and rustling their leaves. I found myself staring at them as I walked further and further into the forest, barely able to take my eyes off of them to watch where I was going. That's until something, tall and dark, caught my attention deep within the trees off the path. I squinted to try to make out the large object, but I couldn't discern what it was from where I was standing. Against my better judgment, I turned off the trail and started walking towards it. Curiosity had gotten the better of me, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep that night unless I quenched my thirst for adventure. As I got closer, I found myself puzzled as I realized what I was looking at. A dark, colored, metal staircase leading to nowhere. I walked around the base of it to see if I could figure out what had become of the rest of the building. To my surprise, there was no evidence of any building ever being connected to the set of stairs. I chuckled to myself about what I just found, reaching for my back pocket to get my phone for some photographic evidence. I quickly realized that in my excitement to get out into the trails, I left my phone behind in the cabin. I figured it wasn't the best idea to be out here without a phone, so I turned back and found my way back into the trail. to head back to the cabin. I hadn't realized how much the hike took out of me, so I took a shower and decided to spend the rest of the night just relaxing. The next morning, I woke up feeling energized, but I couldn't get the thought of that bizarre staircase out of the back of my mind. After making myself something to munch on, I laced up my boots once again, double checking to make sure that I had my cell phone this time, and I set out to get some pictures of my recent discovery so that I could convince myself that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. After walking for quite a while, I started to feel defeated, unable to locate where I had found the staircase. As I began toying with the idea of heading back to the cabin to make myself something for lunch, a strange noise caught my attention from up ahead in the trees. I began to walk towards the direction of the sound, and soon enough, what had originally started off as a low humming noise had evolved into the rumbling tones of tribal horns being played in unison throughout the forest. The sound was growing loud. As I continued towards the source, a creeping feeling of dread began to pull in the pit of my stomach. I felt like I had been drawn into a state of hypnosis by the sound of the horns. I snapped back into reality, and there in front of me, the staircase. Somehow, I had made my way back to the foot of the mysterious staircase. At this point, the horns were sounding so loud that I felt as if I was being guided by a force beyond my own control. And I kid you not, I felt myself placing my foot on the first step of the staircase, slowly beginning to ascend against my own free will. I reached the top, feeling a cold sweat break out across my entire body, my heart pounding, but it felt as though I could not will my body to turn and leave. A deep sense of dread coursed through my veins, churning my stomach and making me feel weak as I was staring into the forest from the top of the stairs. And that's when I noticed the edges of my vision beginning to darken and fade. Only moments before I lost consciousness, I got a glimpse of a tall, dark looming figure standing in the trees, watching me from afar. Seconds later, I felt my legs begin to fold beneath me, and the sound of the horns faded to a peaceful silence. When I woke up, I was lying in my bed back at the cabin. Panicked, I reached for my phone in my pocket, checking the time, nearly midnight. My first thought was that I had actually come back from my hike early and had taken a nap, possibly having a nightmare in the process. My memory seemed hazy, and I was struggling to remember all the details. I dismissed my fear as being a part of my overactive imagination and the stress from my job working its way out of my system. I let out a sigh of relief and began to calm down. That's until I noticed I was still wearing my hiking shoes. I have been exhausted many times in my life, but never to the point that I would have worn my muddy hiking shoes to bed. A sudden and lingering feeling of being watched rushed over me as I remembered that the large panoramic window to my right remained fully uncovered and open to the inky black forest surrounding the cabin. My hands began to shake as I summoned my willpower to turn and face the darkness, assuring myself that there would be nothing there. To my despair, what I saw outside of that window against the backdrop of swirling darkness and moonlight was a tall, black figure, the head resembling the eyeless skull of a deer. Several sets of bony antlers twisted and snarl around the top of its head, framing the cracked and decaying bone and limply hanging jaw that composed the rest of its body. Its body seemed to be made of twisted branches and vines. I screamed, shuffling backwards and scrambling for my car keys on my nightstand beside my bed. I grabbed them, turning and bolting out of the cabin straight to my car, not even stopping to gather up my stuff. I turned the key in the ignition, and I was confronted with the terrifying creature standing straight ahead of me, fully illuminated by the headlights of the car. Without hesitation, I threw the car in reverse and spun around, speeding down the dirt road as fast as I could, and never daring to check my mirror. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment. After making it back inside, I checked my phone to see if I was able to take any pictures so that I could show or tell anybody about what happened without them thinking I was crazy. But there was nothing there. I'm still not sure exactly what I saw back there or what it was that I discovered. But all I know for sure is if you ever find a staircase in the woods, turn and run away as fast as you can. So this happened in the summer of 2020. I live in Colorado, and me and my buddy were both laid off because of the you-know-what. And we decided to go on a 22 or so mile hike in the mountains. It was this fairly well mapped out trail that was at about 12,000 feet elevation. And we figured that we're going to be out there for 2 nights. The first night we're exhausted, but we're making good time. We hike a bit off the trail and we set up a campsite. We marked the area where we went off the trail so we could find it again the next morning. Everything seems normal, so we go to get back on the trail that we marked, and we see this guy. We figure that he's homeless, but he's just sitting by a tree on the trail, waiting for us to come out. We try and talk to him, but there's no response. He just stares at us. Both of us were a little freaked out at this point. He looks like he's covered in dirt and possibly blood. We continue to hike and just leave him there, but we continue to keep our eyes peeled. The rest of the day is very uneventful. We have actually almost finished our hike, and we're going to set up camp mid-afternoon and just relax. We plan to smoke some weed, but before we do that, we still gotta find a place to set up camp. So eventually we go about 1.5 miles off the trail into the woods. And before we even settle in, this guy shows up again, just from out of nowhere. And whenever he walks by, he doesn't make a sound. We have no clue how he found us. We figure that he must have tracking skills. Also, we have no clue why, or how he even followed us for 9+ miles of rough terrain. No equipment or anything, especially without us knowing we were being followed. My buddy is enraged at this point. The guy just starts mumbling weird sounding gibberish under his breath. I can't even tell if it's English. We decided to leave the area, so we just hurry up and pack. The entire time, he is just standing there and watching us from 10 feet away. We finished the last bit of the hike in the light jog for like 4 miles. We're totally exhausted because of the elevation. We load up and we drive off, calling the nearest ranger station. We told them everything, but they didn't really seem to care. And if you're wondering exactly what he was saying, it was most likely incoherent stuff. But when he was just speaking nonsense, gibberish or whatever, I thought it sounded like he was speaking in some other language. He was mumbling a lot, so it was hard to tell, but it definitely sounded like there was a rhythm that I could make out sometimes, if that even makes sense. My friend, on the other hand, believes that this guy was possessed or being used as something, but God knows what. Always be careful when you go hiking or backpacking and you end up seeing the same person, well, the same stranger, twice in different locations. So I want to tell this story that I just remembered the other day. I'm still not sure what it was, but it sounds like what people in North America might call the skinwalker, or some type of creature based on the stories that I have read. Now I have told this story to other people, but here it goes. I would consider myself a kid back then. And by the way, this happened in the UK. So we go spend the summer at my uncle's place while he and my dad work on his house. My uncle lives with my grandmother and they have this huge house in the middle of the woods. It has a bunch of hills as well. As my dad and uncle work on the roof, I decided to go exploring in the gardens. A small clearing of land surrounds the house before it transitions into a thick woodland. I see a patch of no grass in this small area. I head over to see it, thinking that it was a log or something, but it happens to be a deer carcass, and it smells horrible. Deer are quite common in this area. I remember it. The flesh had been torn from nearly every bone, but from around the head. I start to feel a cold sweat and I just leave the area instead. I head back to the house. I climb up the roof using the ladder that was there, and I tell my uncle about what I saw. I remember him stopping as soon as I said that, and looking out towards the clearing that I was talking about. After a few seconds he says, "Don't worry about it, it's most likely a fox." Inside of my head I'm like, a fox? Are you fucking kidding me? But I do shrug it off and go inside and call it a day. Sometime later, about 2 weeks or so go by. Me and my uncle and dad head down to a local DIY store one morning to get some tools and other things. I don't remember everything we bought. This is nothing unusual, and then we head back home and have lunch. As we're eating, my grandmother says that while we were out, she saw a weird shadow, almost like an animal walking around in our driveway. She said it looks like a big dog. However, its hind legs were longer than its front, but it was just a shadow to her, so she couldn't see it very well. And me at this age, this scares the fuck out of me, and I immediately think about what I found the other day. My uncle, who had been deep in the woods plenty of times, tries to say that it was most likely a wild cat, or like a black panther or something, and that could have been a reasonable explanation, as in the 1970s, owning large cats was banned in England, so many people just decided to abandon all the animals they had by letting them free into the woods. But there was no way a big cat would go so close to our garden, not to mention our driveway, as they are very timid as far as big cats go. So I spend the next week or so nervous that I can't even go outside half the time. So a few weeks after my grandmother had sighted the weird creature, I had forgotten all about it by this point, and so would everybody else. On the final week, I have to stay at my uncle's before he and my dad have a 4-month break. The woods surrounding the house are on the side of a steep hillside, which apparently is popular with mountain bikers. Me, my dad, and my uncle decided to go into the woods because, why not? And to see how well it is for mountain biking. I completely forgot about the previous events before this, like I mentioned. So we go in through a gate at the bottom of our driveway and head into the forest. The air is musky. It's really hot, like 30 degrees, and it's also pretty dark. So after about 30 minutes into this, we're deep within the woods after heading in one continuous direction up this hill. There happens to be plenty of ways that we can go, since they're all different directions that have been left by bikers. We stop to look at our map, and all of a sudden, we hear this loud sound, and we all turn to see a good number of deer sprinting like lunatics up the hill. I was too excited about exploring to give a damn about this, but I happened to see that my uncle actually looks concerned, and he says that it's a good idea to keep heading up the hill. We get to the top of the hill, and we're outside of the woods at this point. We stay up there for a while, and my uncle says that we're gonna head back down in a few minutes. We head closer to the woods and we smell this pungent smell, something rotting. I know there wasn't any sewers up here, so I know it had to be something. We decide to head back down, and my uncle digs into his bag and he pulls out this huge blade. He then says that when he saw the deer running, that he saw something else, and that it was standing upright and had the posture of a dog or a big cat on its hind legs. In my head, I'm freaking the fuck out. I'm remembering what my grandmother said on the deer carcass. I see my dad in the corner of my eye holding a what the fuck face and almost laughing, calling my uncle crazy. Also, as a side note, ever since another one of my uncles died, I have 5 of them. 4 years prior to this, my uncle, the one I'm with now, started to act a bit crazy. So it's starting to get darker, and we start heading into the woods all the way down. My uncle is getting crazy. He is starting to squat down, telling us to be silent and to keep our eyes out. The smell continues with us all the way down. After 15 minutes or so, we can see the exit to our garden, but something is off. The lights are on. This is strange for us because the lights on the outside of the house are motion sensitive, and since our grandmother never goes outside by herself, it means that something the size of a human must have triggered them. They got a cool down time of about 30 seconds if I remember correctly. A minute later, we hear the screeching sound from about 100 meters behind us. Everyone basically jumps out of their skin, turning around to see this lanky, crooked, dark humanoid figure, about 2 meters tall from what I remember. We all completely lose our shit and start to run towards the gate. All the while, throughout this whole time, I can hear this thing running towards us as well. We run through the gate as fast as possible. When the garden lights decide to switch off, we happen to be in the pitch black and can't see anything. My dad, who's been holding my hand since we started running, pulls me nearly off my feet as he suddenly changes direction. He reaches the house and the lights turn on. We turn around to see darkness. My uncle, who was halfway down the drive when the lights turn on so we could see around us, runs up to us and says that he could see it just behind some trees. But the lights dazed him, so he lost sight of it. After about 30 seconds, the stench begins to fade. We head back inside and talk to my grandmother. We ask if she's alright. She said she's fine, but that she could hear someone talking and knocking on the doors the whole time that we were gone. After a few seconds of silence, I ask what the hell was that thing. My uncle tries to explain the big cat theory, and that it was most likely a panther standing on its hind legs. In my head, I quickly say BS, but we don't say anything else after that. We did spend one more week there, and then my dad and I took off. The house that my dad and uncle worked on was just completed 2 years ago. But mind you, this happened around 10 years ago, and ever since that night happened, my uncle just loaded up on all weapons and went pretty crazy. He was also diagnosed with severe depression, and also some mild form of OCD soon after that as well. I guess that sight, combined with the death of his brother, really did fuck him up mentally. But as soon as he finished the house, he ended up selling it and moved into the local town. Also, as far as I know, how it looked, the most detailed description that I can give is that it had a human head. There were no antlers or anything like that. I'm not sure what the hell this was, but if anybody has any idea, let me know. My name is David Hernandez, and what I'm gonna share with you is the most terrifying experience I have ever lived. This story happened a few years ago. At that time, I lived in a place called San Jose Paso Nuevo, very close to the Cofre de Perote, in a very small town with only a few houses, and it's very quiet. Unfortunately, in this place, I lived through a terrifying experience, one that has to do with an encounter with a nahual. For several months, many people began to report that their animals were disappearing. There was no logical explanation, because even animals disappear during the day. This was a very serious situation, because as I mentioned, it's a fairly poor area. Losing an animal means losing a lot of money. People gather in the classroom of Don Agustin, the oldest man in the town. They began to organize to deal with all this. Some people thought it was someone from a nearby community, intending to take the animals, while others thought it was a coyote from the area. Fed up with the situation, people started to stand guard at night near the pens to catch the culprit. The first few nights, the men who stood guard swear that something made them fall deeply asleep. When they woke up, they realized that the 2 pigs were missing. Angry and upset, they began to count the lost animals in the village, and realized that a total of 52 were missing. The most affected by the situation was a man by the name of Humberto. This man had lost about 35 animals from his property, which was near the town limits by the mountain. This led people to think that maybe it was some sort of predator from the Cofre de Perote. attacking the poor animals. To confirm this theory, there was the testimony of Humberto's wife. The lady recounted that one night, she went out because she heard the dogs barking. She walked around carefully and realized that a strange creature was on top of the perimeter fence. This was unlikely because the fence was almost 3 meters high, but this animal was on top and seemed to be some sort of dog. When the lady approached it, the animal jumped and ran off into the darkness. The lady told the story to the people of the town, and her husband offered a large sum of money to whoever kills this beast. My family was always short of money, so I was one of those who volunteered to stand guard on his property. That night, at around 1:30 in the morning, we were watching the goat pen because it seemed that those animals were more like. The pen was made out of stone with adobe, and we were just behind it. Soon, some of our companions fell asleep, and we didn't know how it happened. We were talking and out of nowhere, they just fell asleep. Those of us who were awake began to hear a strange noise, and we decided to prepare the weapons because we had confirmed that it was just a coyote. Maybe this was the reason why everyone else fell asleep, because in my town, it is said that these animals have some kind of witchcraft power. We were getting ready to face one, or maybe several coyotes, but we were not ready to face whatever it was that appeared before us. We heard heavy footsteps, and they were gradually getting closer. It was near, and that's when we saw it. A huge creature, gray in color. It was crouching just in front of the pen. I can't explain it. This animal was maybe about 1.5 meters tall in that position, and just when we thought that its size was incredible, we were in for another big surprise. The thing stood up, and its eyes were completely white. It had only one ear and a very slack jaw. Its fangs were visible, even more so with that ugly mouth, and it looked extremely thin with fairly short fur and claws about 10 or 15 centimeters long. We didn't know what to do, and we had heard stories of nahuales from our grandparents, but it had been years since such a creature had manifested in this area. I couldn't believe a single finger. I was paralyzed with fear, just like everybody else. It stared at us for about 5 minutes, and I swear, those minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, after being completely still, the creature began to move its head up and down. In a matter of seconds, it leaped into the pen, and that made us react, so we got ready to shoot it, but all of our guns jammed. This creature lifted 2 goats and ran off. We reacted a few seconds later and started the pursuit. We were guided by the sound emitted by the goats, and the creature was headed towards the Cofre de Perote. Some of us ran while others went on horseback. Obviously, the latter group got there first. They arrived where the trail disappeared, and we arrived about 30 minutes later. Those who were already there told us that the strange creature had entered a cave about 10 meters away. I don't think anyone in the town knew of its location, because if it weren't for this situation, we would have never found the cave. We were guarding the entrance, but nothing happened. Hours passed, and it was dawn when those who had gone on horseback returned for Mr. Humberto. They told him what happened the previous night, and the priest of the town came down to the cave around 8 in the morning. He was told about the events of the previous night, and the priest blessed the place. As soon as he started blessing the place, we began to hear a man crying. The priest told us not to be tricked by it. It was a trick from the Nahual. When the priest finished praying, that's when the loud screams joined by curses were heard. We ended up deciding to seal the entrance with rocks and place several protections that the town's priest gave us. We stood guard there for 2 more nights just to make sure that it didn't come out. And during that time, we heard the same howling several times. It seemed like an animal was trapped in the cave, and all we could hear was its desperate attempts to escape. A few days had passed, and a lady with a baby in her arms came looking for her husband. She was from a nearby town called Tonalco, and she said her husband hadn't come home for several days. The last time he left, he said he was going to San Jose Paso Nuevo to buy some animals. We didn't know what to tell her. We asked what her husband did, and she replied that he bought and sold animals. She confessed that their financial situation had improved only a few months ago because they were very poor. But since her husband started this business with a friend, things had been better for them. There was no doubt in anybody's mind that this man was the same Nagual that had been stealing the animals. We told the lady that we didn't know anything about her husband. Sadly, she returned to her town, and from that day on, weird things started happening in the town. During the night times, people would hear weird noises in the middle of the night in the streets. They said they would see strange black birds perched on the roofs of the houses, and a horrible smell of rotting flesh in the early hours. To make matters worse, many people returning from work late at night would claim to see a man dressed in black walking towards that cave. The priest said that the man was the same one who came to visit his son after having experienced all this. I eventually decided to move, for I became very afraid, and every night I dreamed of that creature that I saw. I ended up asking for help from a relative who lives in Costa Rica, and he kindly let me live with him. From here, I share my story with you, and I swear, it's not a joke. If you visit the town of San Jose Paso Nuevo, you can hear the same exact story from the mouth of many people. Most days the walls are empty, bare, that shade of black that I hated so much, that I told her made it look like our bedroom was a witch's coven, which in turn only made her love it even more. She said she always wanted to be a witch, ever since she was a little girl. And then she pressed herself against me and asked me if I had any issue with witches, especially ones who could do this. And then it didn't take me long to shut up and forget all about it. But some days, if I'm lying very still and holding the stone in my hands, the walls open. I'm not sure how to explain it. It's as if the paint gets darker and darker, and somehow thicker, more tangible, as if it expands in all directions, getting deeper and wider, and slowly it yawns out in front of me, going back and back until I see them. I think there are poplar trees, thin, and with white trunks, reaching up into this new darkness with empty branches. Once I see the poplars, I know it's time to get up. That's when the wall is, I suppose, no longer a wall, but something else. And when I step off my bed, the floor is not wood. The first few times it happened, I didn't go very far. I would maybe walk a few minutes before turning around. I would explore in one direction or the other. This strange and secret wood that appeared in the walls of my home, it seemed, for the most part, to stay the same. It felt vacant somehow, as if something was missing here that was present in the real world. But as I spent more time there, that feeling grew less and less. I don't think I had much in the real world, not anymore at least. Not after Mary got sick, and her skin shrunk around her bones and the hollows of her cheeks. Both of her wrists were turned to pale twigs. Her breathing grew rasping, pain, not even after we were told that she didn't have much longer, that despite their best efforts there was nothing they could do, and that we maybe had a month, just a single month to squeeze in what was meant to be a lifetime. I could only tell her I loved her so many times, only spend so long holding her as she lost weight, try to pretend I didn't care, trying to pretend I didn't know she cried in secret, and try not to admit how scared she was. Once, she confessed to me, after a sleepless night, that she had spent vomiting into a plastic bowl, in a voice small and scared that she didn't want to die, that she was so scared sometimes she couldn't breathe and she thought she'll do anything to make it stop. The worst part was I couldn't do anything. I didn't know what to say to that, or what would help. The truth was unavoidable, real. I didn't know her family well, and at the funeral they seemed to avoid my eye contact. She had always said they were strange, had never wanted me to meet them, had said that there were things buried there that she did not want to uncover. They wore funny clothes. They smelled like strange herbs, and they spoke in whispers at the service. It hurt even more. The thought that there was this whole part of her life I knew nothing about, and that I would know nothing about. And then it would hit me, how much we still had to do, how much more of her there was to love that I never found time to. And I would close my eyes until the feeling went away. The funeral had been in the morning, and I sat by her grave until it grew dark. I read parts of her favorite books out loud, parts of Frankenstein, Rosemary's Baby, that she had underlined several times, pages that she had folded the corners of and left, in her handwriting tiny exclamation marks and love hearts, pages that she had marked with little drawings, all packed into the little margins. I loved her for that, always filling the spaces that should have been empty. Her grandmother had stayed for a while, her eyes entirely white, blind, I assume, and without saying a single word. I don't know if she knew I was there, or if she thought she was alone, but we stood for an hour at least together. There was something about her I couldn't place. She moved as if she didn't quite belong in this world, as if reality. Then she bowed her head, said something in a language that I didn't understand, and she left by the tombstone, a black pebble. We hadn't moved in yet. Most of our stuff was still scattered across the country, some at my parents', some in our old flats, some at various friends. Our house was bare, except for the bed and the basic appliances. I had, at the time that she died, nothing of hers but the books in my bag, the clothes in her closet, and a hole in my stomach that I thought would never go away. And so I took the stone. I know, I shouldn't have, but it felt like an artifact of her life. Somehow it felt as if by taking it I could hold on to her for a little longer, that I could have something that was hers, was meant to be hers, and that maybe she wouldn't slip away so fast. I almost fell, as if she might come back for it. I had this image in my head that she would walk up the stairs one morning, flushed from a run or with breakfast, and she would say that was her stone, and that she would stay a while, perhaps the whole day, that it would give her an excuse to come back from wherever she was, and just be with me, until she had to go back. I started spending more and more time in the forest. Sometimes I would go for hours, just wandering around the trees, listening to the faint sound of a brook somewhere. Closing my eyes and focusing on feeling nothing, I discovered a small hill. If you climbed for long enough, there was a spot where the trees thinned, and you could see the forest around you. Endless white needles from the black soil, stretching on in every direction. I saw the brook. I had only heard it up until that point, following the trail it cut. That is where I saw her, washing her hands in the brook, humming something slow and sad to herself. At first, I thought I might have gone mad, thinking that delusion finally caught up to me, finally dragged me under. But no, I was sure that was her. I was sure my mind couldn't recreate all of her, the way she bit her lip as she thought, the way she hummed with her mouth slightly open, so it sounded a little bit like singing, the small perfections I recognized, but could not name. I had no other choice. I ran towards her. I shouted her name over and over, "Mary!" And she looked up, and suddenly seemed so terrified, and she shouted that I couldn't be here, that I must not be here, that this place wasn't meant for me. I tried to shout back, but the noise had been caught in my throat, and the air ate my words, and I was mute, and I felt my legs grow denser and heavier, and the closer I got, the more I could see how scared she looked. I was convinced that she needed saving, and as I grew close, I felt the world around me shimmer. I stumbled and found myself in bed. I had been so close. From then on, it was an obsession, finding her. I would spend days in the woods looking for any signs, climbing hills, mapping the whole forest in my mind, following the stream until it led to a lake. Still, nothing. Just a vast black landscape, dotted with white trees. If I turned before entering the forest, I would be able to see my body, still lying in bed, facing the ceiling, and it was the same when I returned. Sometimes I would come back to find my parents or friends surrounding me, eyes wide open, and they'll be talking to me softly, telling me it was okay, that I was okay. And I would have a moment before I climbed back into my skin and bones that suddenly felt so heavy to watch as they touched my hair and held my hand, and I did nothing but stare into space. As I went deeper into the forest, it began to change. The trees got thicker, taller. I also began to get the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not just that Mary was here, somewhere, but that something else was. I could sometimes smell it, musk, sharp, among the cool dirt. It was something heavy that bruised the bark of the trees as it passed. It could smell me, the heat and the scent that I would leave behind. I knew that much, and I would often retrace my steps, heart pounding, as I made my way back to the bed, to find that it had torn the trees behind me, uprooted them, and stripped them of bark. I imagined what it would do if it found me, what it would do if it found something that wasn't made from cold wood, but that was made of flesh and bone, and warm. The longer I spent there, the most present it grew. I would see huge antlers through the gaps in the trees, a humanoid figure making its way to the base of the hill I was climbing. I would hear low moans from somewhere behind me. I figured it didn't want me there. It was out to find me, or worse, Mary, before I could even find her. If I hadn't wanted so desperately to see her, I might not have returned, but it became a compulsion. If the walls wouldn't change, I would just wait. I would move my thumb over the surface of the stone in long, slow circles, keeping completely still, as if moving would somehow break the spell the stone was casting. But this beast got smarter, faster. I know it was waiting for me when I came, and sometimes I would have to double back on myself, waiting for the sound of it crashing through the trees to fade, or for its low and mournful groans to fade completely. Sometimes I felt there was more than one. I would hear the groans echo, bursting from the trees in the distance at various points, a whole pack making that strange sound, searching, maybe for each other. In my worst moments, I thought they were maybe communicating about me, that they were somehow all grouping together to find my position, that one would come crashing through the trees, all rotting skin and bone, and it would pin me down and try to burst me open like a fruit. And when these thoughts came, I would have to steady myself against the trees and remember to breathe. But I kept going. I next found her by the shores of the lake. She was washing her hair slowly. I watched her for a while before saying something, watching the way she pursed her lips slightly as she concentrated, the way her back was arching when she would lean back. I moved out from behind the tree and asked her what I've been thinking this whole time. Asked her what she was doing here. She said she was waiting, that she was waiting here for me, but that I shouldn't be here. Not yet. That I have so much more to do. She kept going, telling me that I was wasting it all by being here, that this was a sad and lonely place and I shouldn't have come, that I should have never came. She said if I stayed here too long, I would forget why I came. My memories would leak from my mind like gas. I would forget there was anything outside the forest, that I would forget that the world wasn't just endless black soil and black water, and that she would hear me, not saying her name but moaning into the night, and, as if on cue, there was the noise of a beast in the distance, and I realized what a lonely sound it was, how confused and sad and searching it was. She said she would wait here for as long as it took, but that I shouldn't return until I had to, until I had no other choice. She said that she loved me, said that she knew I loved her, but that there were others who needed loving too. And as she spoke, the forest grew thin around me, as if it had the texture of smoke, and behind it, I could see my parents. And my friends sat around my bed, talking in whispers, holding my hand, stroking my hair, watching over my body, as it was staring with eyes wide open at the ceiling and did not move. I told her I was scared, that I didn't want to go, that if I become a beast, at least I would be with her, and she shook her head. I tried to say something, one last thing, but I couldn't think of anything fitting, of anything that could sum up everything that I wanted to so much to say. As I opened my mouth, it wasn't in the forest, but in my bed. And then I sat up, sobbing so much that I couldn't even speak, and I could feel arms around me and could hear their words. And even though I couldn't turn off whatever had just sprung open inside of me, I knew, at least, that I was loved. I stayed like that for a few hours, sobbing so much that I couldn't even breathe. I couldn't think of anything, until slowly I settled. I took the stone back the next day, placing it where it had been left all that time ago. I could have sworn, though, that when I went to leave, in the space between the trees on the edge of the graveyard, for a quick second, I saw the figure of her grandmother, those white eyes fixed on me, as if she was watching. I renovated the house since then. I painted over the black walls of the bedroom. I take it day by day. Sometimes I find myself wishing I had the stone, and I'll catch myself lying in bed for hours, seeing if I can will myself back into that place. But for the most part, I have put it behind me. I'll see her again when the time comes, and until then, I have to keep myself busy. I imagine the low, sad moan I heard so often in that place, and I know that I have to find my reasons not to join them, that each day I have to find reasons not to join a beast between the trees. The small room that was going to be the nursery, I have now filled with her books. I painted it black, which I felt she would have wanted. From time to time, I'll come into it, pick a book at random and flick through, less to read the book itself and more just to see her handwriting, her tiny drawings, and thoughts that are packed into the margins. Sometimes, if I had a rough day, or have only barely made it out of bed, I'll find something new in the margins, the ink still new, a little note, or heart, or thought, and I'll know that she's not gone, really. And if I close my eyes and concentrate, I'll be able to hear it faintly, the song that she was singing by the lake, and I'll know that she's singing for me. I was out camping in the Northeast, and this one specific time that I'm talking about, I ventured off the main trail to try to find a more comfy spot to set up. So I found my spot. I ate, and I did everything that I had to do before going to bed. In the middle of the night, something wakes me up. I figure it's some sort of animal, but then I hear something else. It sounds like kids. I figure there must be a family camping out, but I think it's kind of messed up that a kid would be on their own in the middle of the night, away from their parents' sight. So I get up. I follow the sounds of the kid, maybe 50 meters from camp through the woods. The kid is hiding beneath the brush. I can hear him. And then I get around it, and there's nobody there. Then I hear this loud animal snort behind me, and then branches breaking and something on two legs tearing ass off to the right. I couldn't see anything. I was scared, but I realized that maybe it was some sort of animal, and I could be hearing it wrong because I got startled. But then I got scared again when I realized that there was no kid. So I walked back to my tent, and I'm a few steps away from when I realized that there are now huge claw marks. I'm talking like 3 claws that were an inch apart on some of the closest trees to my tent. They were just above the height of my head, and I'm 6'1". That's when I hide in my tent, and nothing happens for the rest of the night, especially me sleeping. I decide to leave as soon as it's light outside. I stop at the very first local bar that I can find for some day drinking. The old man at the bar is Mexican, and he says, "Oye, ¿estás bien, mijo? You okay, son?" I tell him that I was camping and I got no sleep. Then he said, "¿Y eso por qué? Why is that?" And I tell him what happened, and he gets a serious face and says, "My people tell legends of things in the forest, but this is weird. They don't really bother people. I'm telling you, don't go into the woods without protection. I know I don't, because you never know what's out there. Cuídate. Take care of yourself." After getting let go at my office job, I was trying to find other means to pay the bills. Unfortunately, not a lot of places were hiring in my area, and the places that were accepting applications were giving out low wages that would just barely cover my living expenses. As the days increased, my search was becoming increasingly limited, until I came across the posting in search of a security guard. It was for a nationally based security company, and they hire people based on the needs of the area. When there's an influx of security requests, it opens up for new applications. To be honest, I wasn't sold on the idea, but the pay was a bit more than the other places that were hiring. The only drawback I could find were the requirements. It was my understanding that I would be assigned to various locations during my time there. One day, I might sit outside a strip mall, and another, I may be walking around a junkyard. I had to think about it for a few moments before typing up and sending off my application. A week went by without any word, and my job hunt continued. I was sure there were more people far better qualified for doing the job, so I tried not to feel too bad about getting overlooked. Then, at the end of the week, I received an email letting me know that I was scheduled for an interview the upcoming Monday. Monday morning arrived. I put on a clean suit and showed up bright and early for the interview. The senior supervisor was a large man sitting behind a desk with multiple stacks of paper on it. He had a very serious demeanor as he looked through my application. He asked me a few passing questions and continued to look through the paperwork. I had no idea if the interview was going well or poor. I just sat there patiently waiting. After a couple more minutes, he looked up from the paperwork and smiled at me. He asked when I would be available to start, and I told him as soon as possible. He nodded and explained that I would be trained over the course of a month. Then I would be dispatched out to various locations for a set amount of time. I thanked him. I shook his hand and I left. That feeling of relief returned as I hopped into my car and drove home. I've been working for the security company for nearly 2.5 years. During my time with this job, I encountered some pretty odd things and guarded even stranger locations. But the reason I'm writing this is due to a job that occurred about a week ago. I had received a call from my supervisor, informing me that I had just gotten assigned to a new location. I asked what sort of job that was, and he said it was just a small warehouse. Apparently, the company that owns it had concerns about theft happening after hours. My boss told me that we were pretty short on manpower, so unless I specifically requested some assistance, I'll be flying solo for the most part. To be honest, I didn't mind being alone for a few nights. The job began on a Tuesday. It took me a bit longer than expected to navigate the streets to the warehouse, even with a GPS. After nearly an hour of driving, I pulled into a small back lot and hopped out of the truck. I stood outside the looming warehouse, so much for it being small. I took out the keys that I had picked up beforehand and entered the rear door. I noticed the security system on my right beginning to beep, and I quickly disarmed it. I flicked the light switch and turned. When I did, I nearly jumped out of my skin. There was a face directly in front of me. I took a step back, almost falling back out the door. Catching my breath, I realized what type of warehouse this was. It was a mannequin storage warehouse. There were hundreds of mannequins of all shapes and designs standing around the building, their formless faces, all desperately trying to grab the attention of any would-be shopper. I zipped up my jacket and rubbed my eyes and began getting a lay of the land. There were a few offices towards the back and workbenches set up throughout the space. Many crates lined the walls, but apart from the mannequins themselves, everything appeared to be normal. I spent the first evening just hanging around inside my truck. I would periodically check the back door but saw nothing out of the ordinary. At around 2:30 in the morning, I was catching up on some Netflix on my phone when I heard a sound coming from outside. My attention was instantly pulled to the door of the warehouse. The sound of a door shutting. I turned off my phone. I got out and walked over to the door. I pulled the door open and peeked inside with my flashlight. Nothing immediately stood out. I called out to the interior, asking if anyone was in here, but not a single sound filled the silence. I checked my watch and returned back to my truck. I only had a few hours left before I could head home. I angled my truck to face the door and made a point to keep a better eye on it until the end of my shift. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, and at the end of my shift when I went to lock up, I thought one of the mannequins had moved slightly, but quickly buried the thought before heading home. The next 2 days on the job went about as normal as you would expect. No noises, no sign of entry or exit, just a lot of time sitting around doing nothing. Then, on the third day, I showed up to the warehouse a bit later because I woke up late. The time was close to 10:30 p.m., a good hour and a half past when I was supposed to be there. I had been late a handful of times over the 2 years working for this company, and it's really not a big deal. I parked and went to check the interior, and that's when I noticed something strange. As I put the key into the door, I didn't feel any resistance. I twisted the knob, and the door popped open. Whoever works here must have forgot to lock up after their shift. I stepped inside to disable the alarm, and nearly fell on my ass as I saw a mannequin standing immediately to my right. It was arranged in a walking pose, with its right arm reaching out towards me. I quickly regained my composure and picked it up and moved it a few feet away, so I could reach the system. I disabled it. I walked around and inspected the area again. Nothing caught my attention. I resumed my routine of sitting outside and keeping watch until my shift was over. When I went back inside to set the alarm again, I gave one more glance around, and everything was fine, until my light cascaded over the mannequin that I had moved at the start of my shift. It was standing straight up, with its arms at its sides, and its head was now looking towards the door. I pretended not to notice. I set the alarm, and I quickly stepped outside, locking the door behind me. I lightly jogged back to my truck, and once inside began to question what I saw. That mannequin was definitely in a different position at the beginning of the night, and I didn't adjust it, aside from moving it a few feet. I drove home and drank a nice tall glass of whiskey before drifting off to bed. The last day made me question whether or not to continue being a security guard. I showed up on time and went inside to check things out. There were more mannequins than on the first day, and I just assumed that they had brought more in. After my once over, I returned to my truck and began to watch a TV show on my phone. About 45 minutes into the series, I glanced up and saw something that sent goosebumps down my arms. The door to the warehouse was completely open. I got out and walked over to it. I stepped inside with my flashlight and called out asking if anyone was in here. I waited for a moment, and just when I was about to close the door and head back to the truck, the sound of something clattering in the back rang out. I felt myself jump in my skin. Something had to have caused that noise, I thought. I called out once more, summoning every ounce of courage in me to step inside. I turned the light switch on and looked around. Everything seemed fine, aside from the mannequins. I walked to the back where I heard the noise and found a small paint can resting on its side. Only there was nothing around it, not even any mannequins. I turned back to the door, and I kid you not, I watched as a mannequin stepped into my vision and pulled the door shut, while another one reached out and flicked the light switch. I shouted, dropping my flashlight in the process. I could hear the clattering of plastic and metal hitting the ground as I stood there frozen in the dark. Regaining my senses, I quickly knelt down and searched for my flashlight. My hand rested on what I assumed to be the flashlight, but it felt different. It was in the shape of a plastic foot. I recoiled back into my side and felt my flashlight next to me. I picked it up, pointing it in front of me. There were 4 mannequins all standing around me, their heads twitching to the left and right real fast, like they were trying to listen for sounds without ears. One of them reached out for me, and I scrambled backwards. When I did, I bumped into something solid. I turned, flashlight in hand, and saw another mannequin looming over me. Unable to react, and in that moment of hesitation, I felt a sharp impact on my neck. My vision went wide, followed by darkness. Sometime later, I awoke. My head was spinning. As I regained focus, I realized I was now sitting in my truck. I quickly looked around, wondering how I ended up back in here. I began to wonder if I had possibly fallen asleep in my truck, and that whole ordeal was just some sort of nightmare. The next morning, I received a call from my boss, saying that the warehouse owner said that I had left the door unlocked the previous night. I apologized to him for the mistake, and he brushed it off, saying it wasn't that much of a big deal. I then told him that I wanted to use some of my vacay time and take off for a while. He understood and said it'll be fine. Just before we got off the phone, however, I suggested not taking any more jobs from that location. He attempted to ask why, but all I could say was, the mannequins don't seem to like security guards. He took it as a joke and chuckled before telling me to enjoy my vacay. I'm not exactly sure what happened, if it was all in my imagination or not, but I think I'm gonna pass on guarding warehouses, at least for a while. It was supposed to be just another uneventful night alone. I had spent a lot of nights by myself without the ever-watchful eyes of my parents. Being only 15, some people might consider that neglect, while others may just think it's unimpressive. A good friend of mine would often brag about staying home alone frequently at such an early age. It wasn't as impressive when I found out that his single mother worked 2 jobs to support him. It was quite sad, actually. Ironically, another friend of mine who was 2 years older than me tells me that he's not even allowed to go outside after 8 p.m., let alone stay at the house by himself. Me, on the other hand, have carefully crafted a trust between my parents. I never begged nor pleaded that I was mature enough to be left alone. I just did what I was told, and eventually, the opportunity presented itself. My dad had come to me one night when I was 13 to tell me that he and Mom were going out to see a movie. They had attempted to find a babysitter, but were unsuccessful. So instead, they asked if I would be alright with staying home alone for a few hours. I shrugged and told them that I would be fine, and that I'll just play some video games and go to bed. My father reminded me about my homework, to which I actually groaned to an agreement. They left, and I nearly lost myself in the excitement. I know it may not sound that thrilling, but I'm sure a lot of people remember the first night they got to stay home alone. I ran around my house, causing a ruckus for about 15 minutes. Then, I retired to my bedroom and played video games most of the night. Around 10 minutes before they returned, I scribbled some answers on my homework and dove into bed, trying to force myself to sleep. I heard them open the door to check on me before slowly closing it. After that night, being left home alone wasn't all that. Don't get me wrong, every time it happened was a welcome event. I could watch movies my parents didn't quite agree with. I could play video games endlessly, and the fridge was full of snacks, so long as I didn't make a mess in the kitchen and didn't set the house on fire. Everything would be fine. But that brings me to last night. My parents were both heading out of town to visit family. Most likely my least favorite people on the planet. They were awful. I would have to listen to my uncle just talk to me all the time, especially about discipline. I once walked out of the bathroom at their house and had forgotten to tuck my shirt in. My uncle snatched me up by the collar and shouted, "There is clothing etiquette in this house." My uncle just likes to make jokes about my appearance or intelligence. The phrase, "dumbass kid," has been told to me on more than one occasion. These instances only seem to happen when my parents weren't nearby though. Trust me, I complained to my parents about my auntie and uncle, yet they would just tell me that they're very particular about their house, and that my uncle lost his filter in the war. So when my parents were getting ready to leave, my mother said the magic words I wanted to hear. "You don't have to come if you don't want to." Inside I had an explosion of happiness. During their packing, they gave me the rundown on everything I needed to know. They put all the emergency numbers on the fridge, including their own. They left me $40 to order pizza over the weekend. Then they gave me the warning that if I do anything wrong, that I'll reap the consequences. As I stood there on the porch watching them drive away, I felt a bit of remorse for not going with them, but the thought of my uncle's screaming face quickly diminished it. I headed back inside and fell onto the couch in the living room. I lay there for an hour or so, changing the channel on the TV every so often. After an hour of mindlessly frying my brain, I heard a knock on the front door. This jolted me awake, and I quickly turned off the TV, almost like if I was doing something wrong. When my senses came back to me, I got up and walked over to the door. I didn't think we were expecting anyone, so I was hesitant. I slowly turned the knob to the door and cracked it open. Nobody was there. I opened the door a bit further and saw a delivery package sitting on the porch. Those delivery guys are like ninjas, I swear. I laughed off my nerves and brought the package inside. When I set the box down on the counter, I noticed something strange. The TV in the living room was on. Even though I was positive I had shut it off when I first heard the knock, I turned off the TV once again and went into my bedroom to play some video games. It seemed like I had only been playing for 20 minutes, but when I looked at the clock, nearly 4 hours had passed. The sun had long since set, and I rubbed my tired eyes. When I took my headset off, that's when I first heard a new noise. It sounded like a tapping coming from somewhere. Even though I couldn't figure the location out, I thought it was a leaky pipe somewhere in the house. I got up and went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water before heading to bed. I looked around the dark living room while I sipped my water. I'm not sure if it was just the lack of light or my growing fatigue, but the room felt ominous. The whole house did. In fact, I quickly finished in the kitchen and walked fast back to my bedroom. After changing and getting into bed, I found myself unable to sleep. I just laid in the darkness, listening to that tapping noise. A few minutes later, I started to notice something about the tapping noise. The sound was moving. It was faintly echoing from my living room and moving down the hall towards my bedroom. I couldn't be sure, but that's what it sounded like to me. My nerves came back as I laid on my side, watching my door. I half expected something to burst in and attack me just then, but nothing did. Only the tapping persisted. An hour ticked by, and the tapping started to move again. By this point, I was pretty sure it wasn't just a leaky pipe. The tapping followed along my wall up into my ceiling before stopping directly above my head. I felt my throat tighten. I stared at my ceiling without blinking. Then, I saw something begin to take shape above me. I know this all sounds strange, but trust me, I'm not entirely sure how to explain it. I watched as a hand began to push its way through my ceiling. It wasn't like something was in the attic, clawing its way through the wood and dry wall. No, it was like something from another dimension was now entering my room. The fingers pushed through first, followed by a hand. I could see its pale skin. An arm followed next. Then a few inches away another hand appeared. The hands and arms dangling from my ceiling. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then what appeared to be black strings began to poke through in between the two arms. It was hair. Slowly the hair grew closer to me as I stared in disbelief. Then a head began to take shape. The head was facing away from me, so I couldn't see its face right away, except for more black hair. Then the shoulders formed until half of its body was now dangling from my ceiling, just above my head. The body twitched slightly, like an electric current was jolting through it. Slowly, the body began to bend backward, and the head lifted up to face me. A gasping, wheezing sound filled in my previously silent room. That's when I saw her face. She looked like a woman, in her early 20s maybe. Her eyes were glassy and vacant, yet somehow I knew she was still staring directly at me. But what terrified me the most about this woman hanging from my ceiling was her mouth. She was completely missing her lower jaw. Her tongue was dangling near her face. She wheezed as she stared at me, her arms growing closer and closer. I wanted to scream, but at the same time I didn't want to move for fear that I would induce a reaction out of her. Her hands reached my face. Her fingers felt like icicles against my skin. I shut my eyes, praying the whole thing was just some horrific nightmare. She forced her frigid fingers into my mouth and attempted to pry my jaw open. Suddenly, I felt my senses come back to me, and I screamed. Swinging at the creature, I flailed and rolled out of my bed. I dashed out of my bedroom down the hall and called my parents immediately. My mom was understandably upset when I called her, but I didn't know what else to do. I told her I was having a pretty messed up nightmare, and I asked her to stay on the phone with me while I went to go check my room. The woman was gone, and so was that ominous feeling that I had felt previously. My mother tiredly told me they would be home tomorrow night and told me to go back to bed. I thanked her for answering, but after I hanged up the phone, I didn't go to sleep. I stayed up all night, watching TV in the living room. I'm not sure what or who that was, or why it was even targeting me. Maybe it was just looking for someone who was all alone and decided that I was an easy target. Maybe it was just an extremely vivid nightmare. I'm not sure, but I think the next time that my parents decide to go out of town, I'll be going with them as well. I'm pretty new to this, but I just had to get this out there. I have to tell someone about this, and I felt like this was the best place to tell people. This all started when I used to live in a small town in Arkansas, with a population around 5,000 plus people. It was a typical average, conservative town. In the summers it was hot and humid, and in the winter it was dark and cold. I grew up on southern entertainment, driving four-wheelers, and hunting every deer season, and maybe some small trapping here and there. But this happened during my last year of high school. I was 17 at the time. I had a girlfriend, lots of friends, and a shabby 1972 Ford pickup that I still have to this day. Anyways, it was November. Rifle season had just started, and I had been getting ready for it. My friend, his name is Drew, and I had been planning this trip for months, and we had everything ready. It was Friday, the end of the week, and the start of the weekend. Our plan was to hike up through the national forest, onto the mountain and set up camp and just have a good time. I wish I could have done something to have stopped myself. I woke up at 3 in the morning, leaving a note for my parents and putting my things in the bed of my truck. I hopped in and drove to my friend's house. He was already waiting for me outside. I got out and said in a whisper, "You have all your things? I don't want to forget anything." "Yeah, I checked again before you got here," he said. He put his bag in my bed and put his gun in the truck, and we took off to the mountain. I had my eyes fixed on the road, and Drew was sitting there with a metal click. And I looked over and he was flicking a lighter on and off. "What's that?" I said, putting my eyes back on the road. "Oh, it's my grandfather's lighter. He had it with him all throughout the war." We then turned and went through the entrance to the hiking site. The change from road to dirt was just as familiar as ever. We stopped and got out. We put on our bags and headed up the mountain trails. It was around 7 and we could see where we were going because the sun was coming over the trees. The birds were chirping and I could see the squirrels running through the trees chattering. 3 hours of hiking later, we came up the campsite that we followed with our map. When we got there, we quickly set up our tarps, and we were quick to find firewood and to start a fire. I told my friend that I would get us some lunch, and I headed off with my rifle to go get something to eat. I walked for at least half a mile south, and found myself breaking the tree line. I decided I would sit and watch for a bit. I sat underneath a large oak tree, and looked for any movement. The sun was rising slowly. I was sitting there, when all the birds stopped for a moment. The silence was deafening. The sharp ringing in my ear was eerie. I scanned slowly with my eyes only, staying as still as possible. That's when I saw movement across the field. It was hard to make out. I slowly raised my rifle and looked down the hill. A deer had poked its head out of the tree line. I only saw its head and neck from where I was at. I knew it was risky to take a shot, but I also knew I wouldn't have another chance to bag another deer. Regardless, it was a doe anyhow. That's when I noticed something. The deer's head was higher off the ground than most deer should be. I felt like it was watching me. It slowly turned to the left. I could only see its neck and shoulders, and I could hear leaves crunching as it moved deep into the dark forest. A little nervous, I decided to head back to camp. I followed the mental landmarks that I saw the first time. A tree that had fell over, dried up creek bed, and I could see the tarps in the distance through the trees. When I got back to the campsite, we decided it was time to catch up on some sleep. I crawled into my tent and got in my sleeping bag and fell asleep. We got up early that morning. It was still as eerie as it was the day before. It just felt so weird, different. No animals in the area, just silence. It was strange. The air felt heavy. There were no birds anywhere, no deer, rabbits, or anything. Not even any crows crying out. We were getting hungry, and when the sun set, we nestled down waiting for some game to come around. It soon grew dark again, and we decided to come together and to make some beans that I had packed just in case we didn't catch anything. As we were getting everything ready, my friend Drew got up from his seat and said, "I'll be right back. I gotta take a piss." I sat there drinking my water, watching the fire dance. And after some time, I noticed that Drew had been gone for a while. That's when I started to get concerned, and I heard leaves crunching, and I jumped and looked towards where the sound came from, and it was Drew. However, his face was pale. "Dude, come over here," he said. "What's over there? Just come over here and look," Drew said as I got up to follow him into the darkness of the forest. As I was walking, I started smelling something horrible, something pungent, and it got stronger and stronger as we walked deeper into the woods. The smell was so bad, and then, as I was walking, something fell on my shoulder. I turned my head to see what it was, but the smell of death made my stomach churn. I leaned over and started to throw up. while this thing that was on my shoulder fell to the floor. It hit the ground with a sickening, squishy sound. I pulled out my light and pointed it to the ground. I got confused for a second when a drop of blood fell on my hand. I looked up and my heart skipped a beat. What I saw was disturbing. The guts of an animal, limbs, pieces. A squirrel that had been impaled on a branch, what was left of it at least. I looked at the face of Drew, still drained of all color. His mouth was open, eyes wide. "Dude, what the fuck?" I said. And that's when we just ran and bolted back to the campsite. How did they get up that high in the tree? Why were they on the branches? "Maybe we should leave," I said. "I agree. I don't want to stay here anymore, man," Drew said. We started shoving our food and things back into the trail packs. That's when we heard crunching a few yards away from us in the pitch black darkness of the forest. And Drew aimed his shotgun at the sound, and I slowly raised my rifle. I pulled out the mag light and pointed it to where we heard the sound. We were about 8 yards away from where we heard it. I flicked on the flashlight, and a deer was leaning, its head out beside a tree next to some brush. With some relief, we lowered our guns, and that's when the deer suddenly fell to the floor. The deer's head rolled down the hill and stopped in front of us. Something had ripped or chewed the deer's head off and rolled it down the hill. But that wasn't the reason I was scared. Someone had been holding the deer's head. And then everything clicked. The bones, the guts, and other miscellaneous parts of animals hanging on the dead tree branches. And that's when I looked up, and a grotesque, elongated hand came from around the tree. We bolted down the hill. I didn't care about our stuff. They could be replaced. We faced in and out of running and jogging. We had our lights and we were looking for a landmark. Anything. Something. That's when I remembered that before we came to the trail, there was a big sign with the words, Washita National Forest. I made that a point in my mind and looked around for it with my eyes. My lungs were burning. My legs were in pain, but I kept running. I would glance back and check on Drew and how close he is behind me. I turned off my flashlight, and so did Drew. We laid up against a tree, still as possible. I could see the breath of Drew, frozen in the moonlight. My eyes finally adjusted to the dark, and I looked over at Drew and turned on my light. An arm long and bony, covered in blood, it sank its nails into the shoulder of Drew. Immediately, blood started spewing out. He started screaming in pain, and he was lifted up, screaming louder and more painfully. He was slammed on the ground. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears. He was dragged through the forest, screaming, taking shots with his shotgun. With every shot I could see his silhouette, moving further and further into the woods. I ran. I just kept running, and that's when I tripped over something, and I started falling down the rest of the hill. I slammed up against a tree. I stopped and my back was in pain. I realized it was quiet again. There were no crickets. Nothing. Just silence. My eyes already adjusted to the darkness. I could see through the woods. In the distance, the moonlight was shining through the trees. I lay still as possible, and then I heard some shuffling, and I saw that thing moving through the woods. It was strange, jagged, intense. I can't even describe it. It just felt wrong. It was tall and thin. Its bones were rubbing up against its skin. It seemed very malnourished. It shifted back and forth as if it was looking for something. When it turned its face, the grace of the moonlight revealed its features. It was disturbing. It had an elongated chin and small eyes, dark folds of skin around them. The skin was darkish gray. Its mouth was large. It spread all the way across its face. It had its teeth jagged and broken. Its mouth and nose was covered in blood and also in chunks of meat. The blood trailed down and covered its torso. I was about 10 yards away from it, and it crawled on all fours. It started to come towards me. Closer and closer. I could smell it. It smelled like roadkill. That's when I threw up in my mouth and held my breath. My hope at this point was that my death would come quickly. I still had some hope that I would make it out alive. But suddenly, this thing started speaking.
James, James, James.
In the most ungodly voice I ever fucking heard. The part that made my hope disappear was when it started saying my name in my friend's voice.
James, James, James.
It wasn't just like his. It had two tones, one deep, and the other, my friend's voice. It kept saying this and it crawled away through the woods, back up the hill. I stayed there for I don't know how long. I cried silently, and for some reason, I started moving my hand around, and I found something. It was cold and rectangular. I looked closer. It was the lighter that belonged to Drew, and my flashlight had broken on my fall. I stood up slowly and grabbed my bag. I turned and slung it into the woods and ran towards the parking lot. It started screaming my name, but this time, it sounded demonic. This time it was no longer my friend's voice. I kept running and I didn't recognize anything. I flicked the lighter of Drew and scanned the area. My hand ended up hitting something. It was a sign, and with the lighter I read, National Forest. I looked back and heard that same screech, and I ran through the tree line. At a distance I saw my truck. I ran as much as I could, and when I got there I flung the door open and jumped into my truck and started it. I flipped my gears, pulled out, and hit the gas flying out of that parking lot. As I drove, I looked back, and God, I wish I hadn't looked back. It had broken the tree line, and it noticed me driving away. It stopped in the light of the parking lot, now shown in detail. It fucking stood tall. It was at least 9 or 10 feet tall, and its face, I'll never get that picture out of my head. It looked angry, and its eyes were full of hate, and what I assumed at the moment, hungry. I put the pedal to the floor. I tore off the side road and onto the highway. I looked at myself. My jacket was torn and ripped. I was covered in dirt and had cuts and scrapes everywhere. I pulled up to the police station, and according to what information I had gotten, it took a while for the cops to stop me from screaming about that it had killed Drew. A bunch of men got together the next day and rounded up a search party, with the sheriff leading the search. I ended up refusing to go. They scaled through the mountain and searched for my friend. It was nighttime when they found him. He was barely recognizable, they said. They found him under a log. His eyes had been ripped out. His tongue was forcefully pulled out. His arms and legs had been mauled. He had been gutted, and his genitals had been cut off. And his face, they told me his face was scratched and seemed to have been chewed down to the bones. And his neck had been broken in so many places. I can't even express through here how terrible I feel for running and not trying to help him. I still remember his tears streaming down his face before he was dragged away from me. On paper it was reported as a bear attack. After the incident, my grandfather came and talked to me. He said, "I'm so sorry about what happened to your friend. All the people in my town know the existence of that thing. I heard countless stories of local hunters that have came across it." It's been about 8 years. I'm 25 now. There is not a day that passes that I don't think of my friend. He was my best friend. I'll leave you with this warning. If you ever go camping, be careful and keep yourself armed. I never want something like this to happen to anyone. I don't even wish that experience on my worst enemy. However, I still go hunting to this day, but I warn you, never go into the woods in Arkansas. During winter, you may just find something out there that you don't want to find. And it may just be a mental thing, but sometimes at night, when it's really quiet, I can hear my friend calling my name. When I was 12 years old, my 15-year-old brother and I experienced a very horrific event when we were at our grandparents' cabin. My grandparents own a cabin on a large island in South Sweden, which contains only 2 cabins, separated by slightly less than a mile. One summer, my brother and I, along with my mother and sister, went to visit them for a weekend. The thing we did most when staying there was to go fishing. On our first day of the stay, we set everything up, and all we had to do now was to dig for a worm, which was used for bait. Grabbing a shovel along with a bucket, we went to the back of the cabin and down a short slope and through a trail, where we would find plenty of worms. The forest is very dense and barely no light shines through, which makes the whole setting a bit unnerving for me, as I have always been easily scared. As we're walking through the trail, I hear something like walking, and I look at my brother with a very scared face. He just brushes it off, as if there was nothing to be afraid of, and says that we go check it out. We walk a bit further down the trail, which I know leads to an open meadow, as I have been there looking for mushrooms with my mom at previous occasions. Before we get to the open, my brother holds up his hands as to indicate for me to stop. I looked over his shoulder and see behind the trees what appears to be a moose just standing there, looking directly at us. I was relieved as I knew they were friendly, and as I had seen plenty of moose nearby. My brother, however, who has never been scared of anything, looks back at me with the biggest eyes I have ever seen, and the most pale I have ever seen someone. Tells me that we should get out of here. Without asking questions, I start to walk back as he keeps pushing me as to make me move quicker, and as we reach the cabin, we are pretty much running. My mom and grandma are sitting at the front doorsteps as we get to the front, and I tell them that we saw a moose. My brother, on the other hand, remains completely silent. Safe to say, there was no fishing that day. The following day, we didn't even bring up fishing. I'm sitting on the porch reading a magazine, and my brother is sitting inside the couch doing the same, even though he still has that scared look in his eyes. I spent the following hour or two reading several magazines, until my grandpa is asking where the shovel is. I realize that we left it when we were looking for the worm the previous day, and I tell him where it is. Just as he is about to go get it, my mother tells me that my brother and I have to go get it, since we left it there. She also tells me that we should dig up some worms, as she wants us to go fishing later that day. I don't ask questions, but my brother seems unnerved by it. This made everything more eerie for me, as my brother is not really scared at all. He's actually pretty much the opposite of me. We put on our shoes and head to the back of the cabin, and walk down the trail heading for where the shovel and bucket is. Once we're about 10 feet from where the shovel is, my brother stops and tells me I should go and dig, as he did it the last time. I do as he says, and I start digging for worms. I have this very strong feeling that he stayed back because he was scared something would happen. I start hearing the bushes around me sway, and then I hear what you could call sneaky footsteps moving closer and closer. Everything is all the more creepy as I have no idea where the footsteps are coming from. One second I'm sure they're coming from my right, and the next it feels like they're coming from the completely opposite direction. I quickly put the few worms I found in the bucket, and as I fumble to pick up the shovel, I feel as if somebody is watching me. My brother walks up to me and helps me seal the bucket, and I tell him it feels like someone is watching us, to which he responds that we should leave. Just as we turn around and are ready to head back, I hear a crack behind me and turn around. I look down the trail and see the moose once again, peeking at me from behind a tree. It looked very different from what they usually look like. At the same time, I'm more confused and curious than I am scared, and my brother is just completely silent. I can't quite see the whole body of it, but I know that something is wrong. I stand for a couple more seconds watching it as it's staring directly at us. From what I can see, I realize that it is not standing on 4 legs. It is actually leaning as an old man with a really bad posture, with his arms hanging straight down. I also had this weird sensation that this thing was trying to talk to me, saying, "Let me help you." In a few seconds I get struck with a panic and start walking really fast back to the cabin, my brother doing the same. It only takes a second before we are both in full sprint running back, and I don't look back until we have reached the cabin. I turn around and the moose-like creature is nowhere to be seen. We put the shovel by the shed where we took it and bring the bucket with worms to the front where my mom and our grandparents are sunbathing. The day happens to go on as if nothing happened, and we don't even speak about it. Ever since this happened, I have never brought it up again with my brother. We both just sort of knew that it would feel wrong to speak about it, and none of us have visited my grandparents at the cabin since then. To this day, I'm not sure at all what I saw. I mentioned it to my friend once, and he told me that if what I saw was true, then it was most likely a Wendigo. He showed me some pictures from Google, and I instantly found resemblance of the creature that I saw back then. Until recently, I had completely forgot about this event, but after reading several stories about Wendigos, my mind has once again been haunted by this event, and in a terrible way, as I realized that what I saw was most likely something far more horrible than a moose. Out of all the things I have read about Wendigos, the most terrifying thing is the people saying never to talk to it. I am just imagining in my head what could have happened if I had tried talking back to the creature. When I felt it was speaking to me. Alright, so some people ask me to share more about the events that happened when I was visiting my grandparents' cabin. I have not been there since then, but my grandmother and her new husband stay there every summer. Do take note that it was about 6 years ago since the moose incident. For those who don't know about the first part, the cabin is located in a very forest area in South Sweden, on a pretty large island which contains only 2 cabins, separated by a pretty dense forest. Through the magic of Facebook, I contacted my grandma. We don't know each other all too well anymore, so I didn't really feel comfortable calling her. I told her about the moose-like creature and how my brother and I both saw it. She then proceeded by typing for nearly 15 minutes, and I waited patiently. Her reply was a full story of her own encounter, with what she said she had hoped was just a weird, disfigured moose. Her writing was in Swedish, so I will do my best to translate it. About 20 years ago, I was staying at the cabin by myself. Your grandpa was working at the time, so I was alone for the whole week. One night, when I was sleeping, I woke up with an uneasy feeling. I wasn't sure why, but I just knew something was wrong. I had this feeling that somebody was watching me. My first thought was to fall back asleep, and so I did. I woke up in what I believe was about an hour, and this time, I was sure something wasn't as it should be. I felt the same feeling that somebody was watching me, and I could hear something moving outside. I grab a bedside candle and light it. As I get out of bed, I choose not to pull the curtains, as I have this terrifying feeling that someone will be staring right at me. By now, I'm pretty much convinced that someone is trying to rob me. I was sleeping in a room at the back of the cabin, and so I walk up to the front and look out by the porch but see nothing. There are no neighbors nearby, and I can't call the police as I have no phone. I decided to go back to bed and try to sleep the fear away, and so I do. I lay there for at least an hour without falling asleep, and even though the sound is gone, the unpleasant feeling has stuck around. At the back side of the cabin, right outside of my window, was an older cabin which we used before this one was built. The place was creepy, and we eventually decided to burn it down some years later. Anyways, I hear something bumping around outside of it, and I realize that I am actually going to have to look out the window. I get out of bed, light the candle again, and go pull the curtains. The uneasy feeling is still there, and I have the strongest feeling that something is going to be staring right back at me. I pull the curtains, and for a second, I'm in complete fear. I see something staring back at me, but it's no robber. It's not a person. It was a moose. I expected to be relieved to find that it was nothing but a harmless animal, but that is far from what it was. After some seconds, I calmed down, and the panic faded a bit. This thing was still staring at me, but it was for sure not a normal moose. I took some seconds to investigate it. For a first, it was not standing on 4 legs. It was bending, as if the upper front legs were just barely floating above the ground. It was also much more slim than all the others that I have seen, and it had this sort of disturbing twist in the body. The antlers just looked flat out terrifying. Naturally, it doesn't say anything, but I had this very strong feeling that it wanted me to come out. It wanted me to let it help me, even though I felt that's what it wanted me to hear. I just knew that this thing had bad intentions. I faint within a few seconds and wake up at morning and let out a scream of panic. The creature is gone, and I'm trying to figure out if I was dreaming or not. To this day, I'm not sure if this actually happened or if I was just dreaming, but now that I know you saw the same thing, I know it was real. My grandma suggested that I should tell my brother that I spoke to her about it, and I am seriously considering doing so. I mean, this for sure confirms that what we saw was not a normal animal. I had some thoughts thinking that it might just have been a handicapped or disfigured moose, but by the way that my grandma said it tried to communicate with her and convince her, you knew it was the same thing that my brother and I encountered, as it too tried to talk to us. Apparently, she had already told the story to my mom and to my grandpa, but they just brushed it off and said it was either an injured moose or she was dreaming. Hearing about this story just made me all the more scared, but at the same time curious about what exactly the creature was, and also what its purpose was. Was it trying to draw us into the forest? Was it actually trying to help us with something? Or did this animal want help? Hopefully, I will get more clarification the more that I talk to people about it. I ended up sending some pictures of Wendigo and skinwalkers to her, and she definitely saw some comparisons between them and the moose-like thing. This definitely sent shivers down my spine. So to all the people reading this, if you ever encounter a weird-looking creature, deer, moose, or anything with antlers, do not speak with it, or even acknowledge their presence. That's exactly what they want. I experienced something in the summer of 2013 that still haunts me to this day, and continues to make me question everything. My girlfriend Anna and I had decided to go camping as a last farewell to summer and to get some alone time. She would be going back to school pretty soon, and I wouldn't be seeing her as often. We had been together for just over 2 years, and I was completely head over heels for her. I was even thinking about popping the question. So on a weekend in early August, I packed up my camping gear and drove 45 minutes away to a park that we would always visit. It was a nice park. It had a lot of trees and wildlife, along with a small creek running through it. We knew the area well since my friends and family had camped there since we were kids. I ended up sending a text message to Anna after parking my car, letting her know that I had made it and I had set up camp in our favorite spot. You see, Anna had been caring for her sick grandmother all summer, and her sister had finally agreed to watch her so that she could get away for the weekend, but she had to wait for her sister to get off work, around 5 p.m. that is. To save time, I had volunteered to go ahead and set up. I went up the trail a bit until I found the spot we always camped at. It was nice and level and was right beside the creek. I immediately started setting up the tent. I wanted to get everything done so Anna didn't have to help. About 40 minutes later, I had the tent set up, our camping gear set out, and our sleeping bags unrolled. Everything was organized and cozy. I was in the middle of starting a fire when I got a notification on my phone. It was a text message from Anna. "I have something to tell you," it read. Just as I started to text her back, I heard footsteps coming down the path. My body tensed up a bit, because you never know what kind of people you'll run into in these woods. We had on a number of occasions met with a few drunks and the occasional rowdy teenager, but I soon relaxed as I saw Anna step out from behind the trees with a big grin on her face. I walked up and hugged her, scooping her off the ground a bit to make her giggle. I sat her back down and asked her what she had wanted to tell me. "I love you," was the reply that I got as she planted a kiss on my cheek. Her voice, though, sounded a bit different and her lips were cold. I asked if she was feeling okay, and she brushed off the question and went to check out the camp. I gave her a brief tour before I went to go cook dinner. I made us each one of those pre-packaged camping meals that you add hot water to. We had pasta, and I opened a bottle of red wine I had brought. We sat around the fire eating. I tried my best to entertain her with some funny stories. The sun was going down, and I was having a great time. I watched the shadows dance off of her and the surrounding trees, and listened to the motion of the nearby creek. The daylight was almost gone when she said she was cold. I told her she could go into the tent to warm up while I cleaned up from dinner. She made her way to the tent, but not before giving me a smile and another cold kiss. I was starting to get worried about her. I wondered if she was getting sick, but I didn't want to nag her, so I didn't say anything. I busied myself with cleaning up after dinner, and it was there that I found Anna's plate of food that she had set off to the side on the ground. She hadn't ate a single thing. I also found her glass of wine nearby, tipped over into the grass. This wasn't like her at all. That girl liked her food and the wine was her favorite. At this point, I was more than just a little worried. So I headed into the tent to ask her if she was feeling sick, and I suggested that we pack up and get a motel for the night. But when I opened the tent and crawled in, I found her sound asleep in her sleeping bag. I contemplated waking her up so we could leave, but she looked so relaxed that I decided against it. I went back outside and finished cleaning up camp and putting out the fire before I lay down next to her in my own sleeping bag. I had a bit too much wine, and I fell asleep quickly. The morning came and it quickly filled the tent with a soft glow as I listened to the birds singing outside. Anna was still sound asleep, so I decided to get up and start breakfast. 15 minutes later, I was admiring the meal that I had made. Well, as much as you can admire. Slightly runny scrambled eggs that came from a pouch. I peeked my head back into the tent to tell Anna that breakfast was ready, but that's when things got even stranger. Anna wasn't there. I didn't think it was likely that she could have left the tent without me seeing her, but maybe she had done so when my back was turned. I waited for a bit, figuring that she stepped out when, quote-unquote, nature called, but 15 minutes passed, and I was starting to get worried. I walked the edge of our campsite and called for her, but there was no response. I walked to the trail and called out her name as I walked up and down the path each way. Still, nothing. I went back to the campsite and checked the tent, but it was still empty. I looked around her belongings, but it was then that I realized that she hadn't brought anything. I couldn't even remember her checking her phone last night, which is something that she was in the habit of doing while she was out in case her grandma needed her. That's when I grabbed my phone and decided to text her. I didn't have any signal, so I walked back up the trail to my truck where I knew the signal was good. That's when the text messages started flooding my screen. All of them from Anna. My hands began to shake as I started reading. I have something to tell you. It's bad news. Grandma just passed away. Are you there? Can you meet me at Grandma's house? I can't go camping tonight. I'm sorry. We can reschedule. Where are you? Fine. I'll be at my sister's house for the night. Call me. My hands started to shake so violently that I dropped my phone. My mind raced so fast that I had to fight to not pass out. I ran back to the campsite and searched everywhere, but there was no evidence of Anna or anyone else. I checked the tent to look at her sleeping bag that had clearly been used last night. I even checked the garbage bag to confirm that there were 2 plates from dinner last night, one with food still on it. I ran back to the truck and sent Anna a text message because I didn't trust my voice not to tremble. I told her I got very sick last night and couldn't text her back. I apologized and offered my condolences about the passing of her grandma. She texted me back letting me know she was okay and that I would see her later that day. I walked back to camp in a daze. My mind seemed to want to shut down. It couldn't process what happened. At first I thought I was going crazy. I thought I had a breakdown and imagined it all. But the sleeping bag and the dinner that she didn't eat told me differently. Who or what kept me company last night? Who or what could look just like Anna, but not be Anna? Had it been a ghost? Maybe a shapeshifter? Or was all of this just some kind of sick joke? I packed up camp with difficulty. My stomach was in knots and my muscles were weak. I felt like I was going to get sick at any moment. I made it home and sent a text message to Anna. I told her I was still sick and didn't want to make her sick. The next time I saw Anna was on the day of her grandma's funeral, where I easily passed off my anxiety about the whole ordeal as grief and sympathy. As I said in the beginning, I never told anyone the story. Me and Anna are now married, and I still haven't even told her. We don't go camping in those woods anymore. We have found a much nicer, and hopefully, safer spot to camp. I look back and remember that night quite often. I replay all the scenes in my head, trying to find anything that will lead me to an explanation, but I haven't figured out anything. I do, however, know one thing. I spent the night with someone or something, and it wasn't my girlfriend. For context, my tribe is the Kickapoo tribe. We're spread out through Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Mexico. I have family everywhere, but I live in Oklahoma. Our tribe still practices traditional ceremonies. That is to say, it's all old school. Outsiders are not welcome, and nothing is written down. And we have several tribal members who don't even speak the English language or know anything about what's going on around the world. Anyways, when I was young, there was a ceremony that had to take place in Mexico every year. All families essentially have to make a trip down there. Out of respect for my tribe, I won't include exactly what happens, but it shouldn't matter. All that you need to know is my grandmother has a house down there that my relatives go to. There's a lot of us, more than the house can hold. Lucky for us, it's cheap to build over there. So my grandmother had a smaller house on that property. My family, my aunt's family, and my uncle's family were there. My grandmother is a superhero, so she is helping another group of family with their ceremony. Since the knowledge is all word of mouth, and so my mom would take care of our ceremony. The entire Rez in Mexico is located in the middle of nowhere, about 4 hours drive from Eagle Pass. And once you get there, it's another 2 hours until you get to the property. It's really big, and there are mountains within walking distance. My grandmother's house are actually at the foot of one. There's no good stories that involve those mountains. It's actually considered a very taboo place. We don't go up there except to hunt. And also, a ceremony must be done. for your protection if you have to go. I was maybe 8 or 9 at the time. My aunt lives in Texas, and my sisters and I don't get a chance to see our cousins very much. So these trips were the closest thing we had to family vacations, even though they were nothing but long work days. There is no electricity over there. As someone who grew up in pretty close to Oklahoma City, I sometimes forget how dark it can be when there are no cities nearby, no lights on the horizon, no cars on the road. Just finding the 2 small houses on the land can be difficult if no one has any fires going. There is a window in each room that is barred, and the doors are made of steel. It's not pretty, but it's necessary, since no one lives in these houses most of the year. The new house is different. The windows are still barred, but they can open. The old house windows were just solid glass. My sisters and I were playing with my cousin E and M in the new house. M happens to be my age, and E is 2 years younger. It was well after sundown, and the headlights on my uncle's truck was the only light. It was getting late, and I say we, but really just the parents, had a long day of work the next day. So everyone started moving for lights out. My family was in the old house, so my sisters and I headed to our room, and this event happened that night. I woke up to screaming. So did everyone else. You would think I would have been panicked, but no. I was a kid who had just woken up by what was the sound of E screaming in the house. I wanted to scream at him to be quiet. I wasn't scared until my dad walked into our room and told us to stay. We don't disobey my dad, so that's what we did. We went to the window and tried to watch outside. My dad was talking to my auntie, and my uncle, along with some of my older cousins, were walking up and down the fence on our property with flashlights. It was too dark to see anything else. After an hour or so, we started getting tired, so we went back to sleep. But the adults were awake until sunrise. I tracked E and M down to try to find out what happened, but E wouldn't talk about it, and M didn't know. He said that E saw something through the window, and that's when we all got a little creeped out. On the last day, I asked my cousin G. G was one of the cousins who was walking up and down the fence that night, and as a kid he was something of a hero to me. He was a genuine tall muscle badass native. He told me what happened since my sisters weren't around. Apparently it was hot in the new house, so my cousins had opened all the windows. E was sleeping on the floor next to one, and woke up because of something touching his face. Apparently, an old pale naked woman was sticking her head through the bars and was looking down at him. Her hair was long and gray, and this touching his face is what made him wake up. He screamed and screamed until everyone came. After that, they looked around but never found anything. I was creeped out, but was pretty sure that E had just had a bad dream. So here I am a few years later. I haven't gone back to Mexico or Texas in a long time. I'm not really involved in the traditional part of my tribe anymore. My sisters have kind of taken over now. I still help when I can, but I have a pretty busy job. I discovered this community a few weeks ago, and I thought about what happened with E way back, so I thought it might make a good story here. Just out of curiosity, I called my mom to ask about it. Surely I wasn't the only one who had thought E had just had a bad dream. Why was everyone taking him so serious? I really wish I hadn't, because now I have this feeling in my stomach when I think about it. She told me this wasn't the first time the old woman had been seen, and G was wrong. They found her bare footprints going from the window to the fence, headed towards the mountains. Judging from the footprints they found, she had visited every window on the land. And mind you, it's in the middle of nowhere, in the pitch black. What the fuck?